Hello, this is Pastor Christopher Murundi of the Lutheran Institute of Regenerative Agriculture, and this is part two of our webinar this week with Joel Grosbach. Joel is a organist and a regenerative farmer in southwest Nebraska, the Imperial area, and we're very glad to have him with us. And I encourage you to check out the first video, the first part of this webinar, where we talk much more, I don't know, philosophically, theologically about care of the land. And in this video, we're going to get a little bit more into the nuts and bolts. Joel concluded the last video with asking the question, well, how do we do this? How do we work within our own context and not manipulate, but work with God's creation to to bring forth fruitfulness, to provide for our families and for our communities. So that's kind of where I want to take off at this point, Joel. How do you? What are the first? Let's actually talk about your farm. What kinds of things are you guys working with and experimenting with and trying as you've been on this journey, and maybe describe the journey that got your farm from where it was to where you are right now. Maybe that's the best way to start, to kind of give the biography of your farm.
Sure. Yeah. Well, thank you. I mentioned in the first video that I'm the fifth generation to be here in Southwest Nebraska. My great-great-grandparents homesteaded just 3 miles southeast of where we are today. So some of the same land, I think, is still grazed by some of our livestock. The original homestead is under a lake now, so that's kind of out of the picture. But so we're positioned right over the Ogallala Aquifer, a particularly productive strain of the aquifer. So we have ample irrigation water. So probably a little over half of our farmland is irrigated. The other half is dry land, and we have about just as much native pasture that we have a cow-calf operation on. So, back in the 70s, really, when center pivot irrigation was first developed, this area was developed for that because of our water, and it has produced a lot of corn and soybeans over the last decades. And really, as I was growing up, those were the primary crops: corn primarily, and on dry land, lots of wheat. But early on, I think back in the 90s, my father was one of the first to buy a no-till drill and to eliminate the summer fallow practice on our dryland ground, because the wind blows here in southwest Nebraska and the dirt tends to blow. And we were just tired of that. Just practically speaking, this was a terrible thing. And so then, with the invention of Roundup and how effective it was, it made that system very possible. And so we began that, and pretty soon we discovered that in our dryland acres, we needed a crop rotation, because wheat on wheat created a weed and disease problem. So we started rotating crops. It was usually a wheat, either a dryland corn or grain sorghum or milo, and then a year of fallow, chem fallow, where you just let it sit idle and use herbicides to control the weeds, maintaining the residue, and hopefully taking on water. On the irrigated side of things, it's lots of corn. We've raised lots of corn. However, it is funny out here in southwest Nebraska, and this is something that I've been working on in my brain for the last, I don't know, let's say 6 months, is that because we have ample irrigation, we tend to treat our irrigated ground like Iowa, or even like Illinois, where we can use the water to create outstanding corn and soybean yields. And so they're highly productive, but yet in a drought, our dryland crops are completely gone. And we seem to treat those different production systems as two different environments, when it's when they are right next to each other in many cases. It's just one has a pivot and one doesn't. Um, we can talk a little more about that later, but that's true. And so as we've come along the way, with irrigation use becoming a concern, and we are allocated as to how much we can pump every year. The dry climate we've had in the last 3 years has become a challenge to us. The reduced effectiveness of herbicides has made fallow periods very challenging because it's expensive to keep those weeds down. And as we are learning, having a living root in the ground at all times is very beneficial to your soil health. And so, as the conversation has changed from just corn and wheat, and now we're focusing a little more on soil health and how we can improve this and manage our irrigation water use. Now we're beginning to explore many other crops. We have, the last couple of years, have raised some millet for seed production under a pivot, which has greatly reduced our irrigation water needs. On our non-irrigated stuff, the last 3 years have been just a disaster because it hasn't rained. And however, we've experimented with using cover crops as a grazing tool for cattle and fitting cover crops into the system where it's appropriate. We're focusing more on high quality crops, food grade crops like edible beans, popcorn. This year we'll have some white non-GMO corn, and developing the systems where we can raise them to the highest quality. And ultimately, managing this irrigation water use so that it is sustainable. It's appalling how much water we've pumped the last few years in this dry climate. And it's just not going to last forever. Our neighbors to the south in Kansas, Oklahoma, Texas are facing this problem. It's a real problem for them. Their wells are drying up. They're having to shift their conversations today and make drastic changes because the water just isn't there. I would much rather be in a position where I've got water forever and develop a system where we can do that. So that's where we are today. Again, we are eliminating every bit of tillage that we can. There are some contexts in crops where we kind of have to, but that just means I haven't figured the system out yet. Then on the livestock side, my dad has had a cow-calf operation for better part of, well, more than 20 years now. And he was an early adapter of cross fencing. And so our big pastures have been cross fenced once, but the drought has been hard on that too. It just doesn't rain, so the grass doesn't grow. And that's been a real challenge. And I'm hoping in the future we can take that livestock side of things and go to even a more AMP grazing, adaptive multi-paddock grazing, intensify that a little bit. And once we get out of this dry cycle and the grass starts growing, use those tools to really get our range back into sustainable condition so that we can weather the next dry cycle a little easier. So that's where we are. We're doing all kinds of things with fertility and crop rotations, compost, extracts, and that sort of thing too. So we can go whatever direction you want there.
Sure. And the first question, I don't know how long that this needs to be too long of an answer. You talked about the need of herbicide especially during fallow times. Is that something you're exploring to try and continue to reduce that and move where you can get beyond that, or is it and how would you do that? What would be the approach
right.
to get there?
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah, the old system of a summer fallow or a fallow period really has shown well, they used to say that, well, it's you're letting your land accumulate water and this sort of thing. But the data now shows that we really aren't saving water in a fallow period. If you're tilling the ground, you're losing the water. If you're using herbicides, the weeds that do come up are using the water. And besides, if it's just sterile soil for a year, there's no biology, you're actually going backwards. So the idea is to keep a living root or a living crop growing as much as we can. Now we are in an area where cover crops, as they would use them in the I states, a rye before soybeans or something before corn, it just doesn't work. Even under irrigation, it can work, but it takes more water. So, from an environmental observing what we have, it doesn't work. Okay, it doesn't work without importing something either from the ground or from somewhere else. So, we can use a cover crop, and we have used a cover crop as the fallow period. So instead of raising a cash crop, we'll raise a cover crop and put the cattle out there for a while and get the benefit of the grazing and and uh, and and of the cover crop effect. And then we also have residue that catches moisture for the next crop. So we try to keep something growing on every acre. Last year it didn't rain; things just simply didn't grow. So we really came up against it there, but also looking at a more intensified crop rotation. And we're speaking dry land here. There's no reason to fallow anything on irrigated ground because we have the water we have water, we can grow something. Um, but even on that irrigated time, when after following irrigated wheat, we like to put a cover crop in behind the wheat. And even if it takes just a little bit of water to get that cover crop growing, it's something to fill the gap. And it keeps the soil biology active and it keeps the weeds suppressed. And we might get a little bit of grazing out of that. So we're keeping that system alive and keeping it going. So we've greatly reduced our herbicide use because we're just used as tools. We're just managing one point in time instead of managing a season with herbicide, if that makes sense. We're really trying to eliminate that fallow period um, as much as we can, as much as we can. Um,
I would like to hear you talk about. Well, I wanted to just observe real quickly. Um, a lot of the I and certainly not all of them, but a number of the leading lights in say regenerative or sustainable agriculture are close to the coasts and get a lot more rain than you do. So
yeah.
I'm always fascinated. Now, certainly in Southwest Iowa, we get more rain than you do, but we don't get as much as say Virginia, or
Mm-hmm.
or other places where a lot of these farmers operate. So I think the what you have said and what I've heard from others, you got to know you need to understand your own farm. What does it
Mm-hmm.
have?
Mm-hmm.
What environment are you on? And then if you have this approach or these principles in mind, then you do what you can on the land that you have. You can't just simply copy lock, stop, and barrel someone else's approach because they're not where you are. There may be some who are in analogous climates, but they're not going to be right there where you are. So maybe speak a minute about that, and then I want to ask about the composting.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And I think those soil health principles um, keep soil covered, living root, diversity, all those principles. They're principles. So the idea is that they can apply anywhere in your context. And you're right. We see a lot of these really fantastic results from these new practices coming from areas where they get a lot of rain, they've got a moderate climate, and they're able to do things much more quickly. And it's a lot of it's water that makes it happen. Um, and so much of this is context driven, and you have to know where you're at. Like I mentioned before, a cover crop before a cash crop is probably not going to work. but using that cover crop to fill the gap can work for us, and to provide some grazing can work for us. So it's how do you take these principles and apply them for where you are? So, if anybody on these semi-arid high plains, remember where you are. It's harsh. It's difficult out here. And the rate of change is going to be very slow compared to what we see the guys doing back east where it rains a lot. But the principles still apply. So all of these things, like maintaining cover, is vital for us out here. Our evapotranspiration rate is astronomical because of the heat and the wind. It just simply dries up and blows away. Keep your soil covered. It's the easiest thing you can do. And I have this thought in this idea, looking where you're at, observing where you are and seeing how it fits. As I look at our irrigated ground, I mentioned earlier that we seem to have two different production systems. We have the irrigated that we treat like Illinois, and we have the dry land that we treat like the desert. And we kind of expect what you get from those two production systems. Observing where we're at in Western Nebraska, I am trying to teach myself to observe what our dryland crops are and what our dryland crops can legitimately do on a normal year, not last year where it didn't rain. So, and then taking that and saying, well, if these are the crops that are best suited for us in a purely dryland natural environment, then let's put them under a pivot and we can shoot for consistency. We can make these crops that are fit for our area be consistent every year. And so if it doesn't rain, we can use some irrigation water. If it does rain, we won't use nearly as much irrigation water. And the problem with treating our ground like Illinois, and we expect the maximum corn yield every year, that even in a wet year, we're going to pump a lot of water to get there. So it's really not a sustainable thing. Where if we can shoot for consistency and use that water as a tool to maintain the consistency, that's the thinking that I am trying to develop. I'm not there yet, but that's part of this idea of observing where you're at. What is the reality of where you're at on the ground? Pattern your production system after that, and use the tools that you have available to make that work.
I just want to advertise, since you're talking about cover, we are going to have either next week or the week after, sometime here before the end of March, we're going to have Vance McCoy of Triple Creek Cover Crops. I think he knows you, Joel. I think you guys have been connected at one point or another. And so we're excited to have him. He's also, Central Nebraska, and of course, cover crop guy. So we'll be excited to have him come in and speak with us a little bit more on that particular topic here in the next week or two. What about the compost? You mentioned that you've been experimenting and working with composting. What exactly does that look like, both in creating the compost and then getting it onto your fields?
Well, for the past, I will say 5 or 6 years, I've been looking at biological inoculants, adding biology, and of course that's the big thing in the industry right now. You don't have to go very far to find a product that has some biology in it, and there's many good products on the market. However, compost is somewhat unique because it will likely take on the specific biological profile that's native to your soil. And you can actually, use your own soil to inoculate those compost piles to create species that are beneficial for your area. Now, I will say, I have yet to create a very successful compost pile. It's tough. Okay, it's just, I haven't had a whole lot of luck. It's an art. It's more of an art than a science, and thus far, I just haven't had a product that I'm happy with. So right now I buy finished compost, and I have an extractor that it has a filter basket in it. You put the compost in there, and it aerates the compost with water. There's water and air flowing through it. You pull the water off, and everything that comes through that screen is the good stuff. It's all the biology. It's all the humic substances that that are actually what's beneficial in compost. And so if you think about your garden setting, you buy 50 pounds of compost, you put it on your small garden. Well, if you scale that up to 1,000 acres, that's an awful lot of compost. And it's really kind of hard to come by here in Southwest Nebraska if that's not just feedlot compost, which we have access to that, and that has its place. So in order to get the same effect, you extract the biology and the humic substances out of it. That can be applied with your planter, through the pivot, with a sprayer, whatever your system is set up to do. And it's pretty cheap. We're looking at $1 to $2 an acre if you buy the compost, okay? Because we figure a pound of compost extracts into about 5 gallons of extract, and you do a pound per acre. And there's no limit to that. If you want to do more, do more. But the idea is that you're getting as much biology in the system as possible. Now, make sure you buy good compost. If you're making compost, they talk about making sure that you've done it right, so that there's nothing harmful. You haven't raised some sort of pathogen instead of a good compost, and there's methods to do that. Again, I say I haven't been very successful in getting a compost pile to finish, and to make my own. But we're still working on it. We're still playing with it. And I could share some resources if people are interested in that as well. But so that's what we're doing. And but I also still buy some biological inoculants just to be sure that I've got the species that I want, especially when it comes to like phosphorus solubilizing bacteria and fungal species. I want to make sure I've got those, because that's what I rely on heavily for phosphorus in my cropping systems now, instead of ample amounts of polyphosphate that doesn't work and is very expensive.
So where do you source your compost from? You said you could get it from feedlots. Where exactly do you get it from normally?
Um, Soilworks is a company out of South Dakota that sells compost for this purpose. It's more of a vermicompost that they've grown specifically to be put in an extractor, that can be applied as a liquid.
Okay. I think what other direction we want to go here. Animal impact. You talked a little bit about working with the cattle, putting them on cover crops, that sort of thing. What have you seen with the interaction of the livestock with cropland? That's certainly something that is generally done to one extent or another amongst quote unquote regenerative farmers. That managed animal impacts is a big part of it. How go a little bit more into that? What's that look like for you, and what benefits have you seen of that?
I think I mentioned earlier that on our dryland acres, taking that fallow period and planting a cover crop to be grazed, just by eliminating that chemical use is a huge thing, is a huge expense saver. The cattle do really well on a growing forage, diverse forage mix. They do very well, and I've even seen dung beetles out in our dryland crop ground that you wouldn't expect, but there they were, and that was really exciting to see. So there's those aspects of it, and plus the nutrient cycling and the diversity of the crop. It really allows you to intensify that diversity on a farm, on a grain production field, where you have that cover crop and you cycle that residue and get the diversity just very, very quite intensely, instead of raising a monocrop rotation which is certainly another way to do it, but it's much more intense. And then that sets you up for the next year. And of course, don't fertilize your cover crop because you want those biological species to reestablish themselves, and then to use that rotation effect and the animal impact for your cash crop the next year. Had a little bit of success with that this last year. Had a piece that had been grazed, I think 3 times. We planted a cover to be grazed. It happened in 3 different seasons before I went back to a cash crop, and planted some millet in a dryland field, but it didn't have to fertilize it, and it produced. Not great, but it did. And considering the year we had, I felt that was an indication that maybe this was a direction to go. I will caution you though, if you're going to graze a cover crop, remember that it has now become a forage crop, and don't take too much. You want to leave 50 to 70% of that forage in the field, because that is food for your soil, and residue to catch the moisture, to stop the wind. So remember what you're doing. If you take it down to the ground, I believe you will go 3 or 4 steps backwards, because you've taken all that carbon out of the system, and you've eliminated your residue, and the dirt will blow, and you've actually gone backwards. So if you go that way, know what you're doing, have a plan, be prepared to get them off. If it looks like they're taking too much, have a plan, get them off, and not next week, but get them off today. So,
Hey, continuing. Oh, that was wonderful. That was incredibly helpful as we think through how to put these systems into place. Continuing on livestock, just so the folks kind of understand the terminology and what you're talking about. I mean, you talked about, if I'm remembering right, cross fence system first, and then paddock AMP system. You want to kind of go into those systems a bit and describe exactly what those things look like on the ground.
mm-hmm. Yeah. So the cross fence idea is where you take a large pasture and you subdivide it, say, into 3 or into 2, and so they're still very large. They're still very large pastures, and you can see some improvement that way, and rotate your livestock that way. However, the really to intensify that system, it's sometimes called AMP, or adaptive multi-paddock grazing, where it's divided down even further into very small pastures, so that you're increasing your animal impact to every acre, and they're required to eat everything, so they can't just pick and choose their favorites. They've got to eat everything. But then the other side of that is the increased rest period that allows, because you've taken your herd and you've concentrated them on one small area, and every farm is different, every ranch is different. Many times they'll talk about daily moves. You've got your 1,000-acre pasture divided down into 10-acre pastures, and so 5-acre pastures, even, just depending on your context and what your environment can support. But then they're moved every day. So one day they graze this tiny place, and the next day they're off and they're on to the next piece, and they may not come back to that original place for 9 months, 12 months, and it gives that pasture a chance to rest and recover, and to reestablish its roots, reestablish beneficial species. Because if the cattle just are allowed to wander and they pick and choose what they want, they'll take the best, graze it down to nothing, and leave the weeds, leave the less desirable grasses, and then they will take over, and your production actually suffers. Again, this is something I'm still learning about. that I hope that we can really develop. Um, it takes a little thought concerning water. You either have to have a pipeline or some means of getting the water because you are moving them. They can't just walk across the hill to get water anymore. Um, but this is a direction I hope that we can move toward, and and really help our pastors recover. They've had a rough 3 years, and it's just, I mean, my father, he's done a very good job of not overgrazing anything. But when it doesn't rain, there's just nothing there can be done. It, it's tough. It's been a really tough few years, and I'm hoping we can get a little rain and see that system improve as well.
How do you oh, I should mention it's interesting. There's a and I can't think of his name right now, but there's a guy up in Canada, and I guess he's kind of just seeing how many cows he can put on each acre, and he just keeps adding them, and seeing how much, with that once a day or even twice a day movement. I think I heard of a farm that did it twice a day. Now that's fairly labor intensive, of course, but and water is the issue. How do you get water to them? And shade too, I think, is also an issue when you do that. Is how are they going to have consistent shade, depending on how your pasture is set up. As we get close to the end here, you've talked a lot about water and a lot about um, the drought that you guys have experienced over the last several years. Um, just to kind of sum up, how do you get ready for the next drought? I mean, you're praying that this year will be a little wetter, obviously.
Mm-hmm.
um how do you, if say like with the wisdom of Joseph, say, we got 7 good years, or maybe we got 1 good year, whatever. How do we get ready
Yeah.
for those thin bony cows that are coming up to eat the fat ones?
Mm-hmm.
How do you get ready for the next drought?
Yeah, we've certainly been pushed to the limit the last few years, as to what really a total lack of rain and obnoxious heat will do, and there's just nothing. And and so I think we have to, again, um, it just all goes back to that observing where you're at and being realistic about the environment in which you live. Okay, if this is the extreme, if this is the extreme that this environment is going to give you, then plan for that and adapt your cropping system so that it will at least endure and not just simply fall apart. Okay. Um, even under irrigation, the we had to pump so much water just to keep the crops alive, let alone produce a yield. But if your goal is maximum production and maximum corn and soybean every year, um, even when times are good and the fat cows are in your pasture, the you're still going to overuse your resource because you have set a new standard by which you think you need to do, and that standard has been imported by somebody, by the industry, by the rhetoric that we have to feed the world or something. So being honest about where you are and using the principles of soil health, and so using your best practices to maintain that. And like I mentioned earlier, patterning your entire farm off of your dry land, your non-irrigated, your native environment. Okay. So that when it comes dry again, we have the irrigation, we have a tool to be consistent, but we're being realistic about what our environment can actually do. And that's a hard thing because we have, the industry sells us on the idea that we've got to have top yield and have top production across the board all the time because we have to feed the world. Okay, we need to stop thinking that way. Maybe our first job is to take care of our family, take care of the land and the resources that God gave you to manage, and make sure that your community and your church are taken care of first. That's where you are. Look around. Who is your neighbor? The people around you. Take care of them. And then hopefully, if we're strong, well, then we'll let we'll let the rest of the world go through the same journey and help where we can. But we're here. Our neighbors are here. Our families are here. Let's take care of ourselves and make sure that we are strong and sustainable.
And that's what rural community has always been about. Thanks be to God.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much, Joel. I appreciate you taking your time today to chat with us, to record these two webinars and bring to us some of your wisdom and your experiences and your reflections as a farmer, as a Christian, as a Lutheran. Thank you so much for lending us your time this morning.
Oh, it's my pleasure. God be praised.
Well, thank you so much, friends, for joining us, and continue to look for new webinars as they keep coming out. Share this video. I think we're bringing a lot of good wisdom to people. I'd like as many folks as we can to encounter these webinars and learn from them as they think about agriculture, as they think about Christians and caring for the land and all those various topics. I am Pastor Christopher Murundi of the Lutheran Institute of Regenerative Agriculture. Thank you so much for being with us. God's blessings.